Hi, my name is Richard Dix, and this is How Did That Happen? A podcast where I look at everyday things or events and try to figure out how they came to be. Every week I will research one topic, and by the end of the episode, I hope to truly have the answer to the question, how did that happen? Hello, and welcome to another episode of How Did That Happen? This week, we're discussing silverware, and I learned that there are some really old spoons out there. Come along for the ride this week as I ask, silverware, how did that happen? All right, it is another episode of How Did That Happen? I just want to, before we get into the actual topic, I wanted to just talk with you guys for a second and just say, I guess I appreciate, the love that I'm seeing on the page. It's growing. Our followers are growing. Our listeners are growing. As of now, I believe we've hit 500 downloads, which is it's pretty wild. And thank you guys for that, because when I started this podcast, I didn't think I'd have 50 downloads. And so to even say that we have 500 downloads now is it makes me want to keep going. Makes me want to put some more topics out there. So if you guys are digging it, come on. We'll just keep on finding out how things happen. That's the goal. And if you're not, let me know why you're not. That's cool, man. There's so many podcasts out there. You can you don't have to listen to this one, but if there's something that you don't like, I'm not saying I'll change it, but it'd be good to know that, it'd be good to know. But yeah, we're gonna be on to our topic of silverware and how that happened. Early humans created sharp tools by hitting two rocks together, and the collisions would break off a piece of those rocks, and that would leave a sharp edge. And that could be used for hunting or to scrape animal skin for clothing. And that's kind of the first real iteration we see of any sort of like tool that they then, that tool then kind of evolves into early silverware. Spoons are the oldest type of silverware, if you will. They did not look like regular spoons that we have now, and early ones, didn't even have handles. They would use any object they could find to scoop the food into their mouths, like seashells or bones from animals. Some of the earliest evidence that we have that people used forks is in Asia during the Bronze Age, which is approximately 3300 BC to 1200 BC. This age is marked by the fact that's the first time that humans began using metal tools. So like before we talked about, it's like any rock they could find or really anything you can make sharp. This marks the time where they were actually taking metals and then making them into actual tools and utensils to be used. And it should be mentioned around this time, they say in Asia, the forks were being used. Forks were also being used in Egypt, which I just feel like when you look at, I don't know, like obviously it gets mixed up, but depending on how long ago these texts are, and I'm not trying to say that anyone's saying that ancient Egypt is Asia, but it's like the idea of Asia it gets further away to the Asia that we know now. I mean, they always knew it was there, but it's like the idea of Asia was a lot more, I don't know, closer than I think we think of back in the day. These, like I was talking about the metal tools from the Bronze Age, we talked about that were possibly in Asia and both in Egypt. They would have been made out of a number of materials, including metal, bone. These were not used to eat, but were actually used to cook food or hold over a fire. Probably like the early versions of like what do they call them, spits or whatever, But they were pronged tools. It's just that's what they did. They didn't evolve into what they are now until later. Spoons were fairly common in the first century of Rome. There have been a large number of them recovered from archaeological digs over the years. You can throw a quick Google search in there, and you'll see a bunch of different like actual spoons from Rome that look a lot like what we use now, just not the same. The spread of forks throughout Europe is said to be directly connected with the spread of pasta from Italy, and I guess that's kind of true. It went from Italy to Spain to France, and what I will do now, since I've read a number of different ways that they say that forks got here, I'll just read you like 2 or 3 origin stories of the fork, and then you can be the judge, right? All right, so there's a theory that in the 11th century, as far as like the origin story of forks in Europe, there's a theory that in the 11th century there was a marriage between a man named Domenico Salvo and a woman named Theodora Endocania. Theodora brought golden forks with her as part of her dowry when she's getting married, right? And so Domenico Salvo is from Venice, and when she gets to Venice with those golden forks, they lose their mind because they're like, why are you bringing, this? They see it as like a, how can I put it? I'm trying to think like an extension of delicacy, like too much. Like basically, the religious people there thought that God already gave you forks in the form of hands. So they were like, this girl thinks she's better than God. And they really hated her. And she actually died 2 years after they got married, and everyone thought it was because she was so prideful with her forks. That's just, you can look that up. The world is crazy. There's another theory. The first time that there is a written mention of a fork or a pronged-like eating tool in European literature is in a cookbook from the 1300s that had a recipe for lasagna. After reading more about this, I'm just not sure how true that is. I mean, obviously they probably had lasagna back then, but it just doesn't seem, it seems too simple to be like, well, they had lasagna and then they had to make forks, you know? The cookbook belonged to King Robert of Anjou, who was the king of Naples as well as Jerusalem for a time, which is an interesting fact. Those are really the two, like, actual, like, where did they come from? There's a lot of different, there are so many different ways people talk about how, like, I honestly just got confused when I was reading about it, because it's like, they'd be like, oh, and then they introduced them here, and then, well, if you look back 500 years ago, they already had them here. And it's like, how do you introduce some crap that you already had 500 years ago? I don't know. That's why I figured I'd tell you a different couple ones, and then, because, I mean, I don't know where spoons came from, and forks and stuff. Some interesting uses besides actually just eating. You know, spoons did more than just load food into the mouth. In British monarchies, they had ceremonial coronation spoons, which that was news to me. I didn't know. I know we talked about knights a couple episodes ago, and they were doing, you know, they were knighting people with actual swords. But evidently, for a long time, in the British monarchy, like the Tudors and those people, they were, when you were getting turned into a king or a queen, bro, they broke out that spoon, and you can still see it. And it's an interesting fact. We'll talk about it later. But like, they have spoons as crown jewels in like the British monarchy right now. You can see them, which I would have never thought that. Let's see. Here's another instance in where they kind of talk about the spread of forks throughout Europe, like how we talked about. They went from like Italy, I believe I said to Spain to France, but it's in 1533, Catherine de Medici went to France and brought her forks with her, because you know you got to travel with them forks. She had forks in her dowry, so that a lucky man, you know, she had forks in her dowry, and from there they spread throughout Europe and continue to, basically in the same way that, you know, the theory of the 11th century Venetian Theodora. It's the same thing. It makes me wonder if it's like, is it the same story just 400 years later? But it's important to know that during this time, they were usually still two-pronged forks for whatever reason. They hadn't thrown that third one on there. During this time, and until the 1700s, forks were considered only for the wealthy and the noble. And early forks varied in size and didn't always fit the meal that one was eating. They were said to be so big sometimes, you know, that and then that you could only like cut meat, you know, but you had other stuff on your plate, or like so small that they were only suitable for desserts, but then you got some meat on your plate. You're just like, I would probably like attribute, like, I would say it's like the same thing as like when we were making the transition from like swiping to like chips, because it was just like everywhere you went didn't have what you had. Either they were like, yeah, we're swiping here, or you go over there and like, oh, we're chipping over here. But it's like for like 3 years, man, it was like nobody knew how we were taking payments. And I imagine it must have been the same way at that time when you sit down to eat and you're just like, oh, I got the little fork this time. Like, bro, we're eating freaking pot roast or whatever, and you know, and you sit down and like you got like this piece of cake and your fork is like you know 10, like, I don't know. So if we're gonna talk about forks and spoons, we got to talk about knives. The butter knife originated from a man named Cardinal Armand Jean du Plessis, and he was the Duke of Richelieu. I definitely didn't get that right. This is an interesting story. He threw a lot of parties, but he hated to see the people he threw parties with reach out and stab their food, right, and eat it off the blade like some sort of barbarian. And he also didn't like the way that you would use the knives at the end of the meals to pick their teeth, also like barbarians. So this dude was basically, he said, I'm gonna shave down all the knives in my house, so you can't do that. You can't be stabbing stuff like that. Don't be picking your teeth with this crap. These are just for actually, like, you know, I guess eating in what he considered to be a humane manner, right? And so basically, the butter knife is born in 1637 at this guy's next dinner party, because he was just like, y'all are heathens, and I got to do something about it. It's pretty wild when you think about it. Next time you look at a butter knife, think about the fact that it came about because a French dude was like, no more. I don't know. Okay. In 1669, King Louis XIV of France outlawed all pointed knives. So once again, French people do not like knives with points on them. That's something I just learned. This was an effort to assuage violence in the streets, but all it really did was make sure that there was only dulled blades on the table for people's meals. So basically, he was like, this decree is going to stop violence because y'all can't have sharp knives, but they kept stabbing people, and then they put butter knives on the kitchen table. It's like, I don't know. It's like laws never work for whatever reason, you know. Steak knives were only given when needed, or the waiters or servants would cut the meal for the person. So it's like, in this invention made its way through the rest of Europe and on through the rest of the world, of course. But basically, during that early times, you would be sitting there and you'd have this big hunk of meat or like these really really tough vegetables, and then you got to be like, yo, my man, or excuse me, servant, my slave, dude, can you cut this for me real fast? Because I don't have, can't be touching them sharp knives out here. It's just wild when you really think about it. Let's see. This is another interesting thing. The difference in the way that Americans and Europeans hold a knife and fork can be explained because of America's late adoption of the fork. And I'm probably not going to explain this as well as other people did that I got it from, but it makes sense, especially because there's this whole idea of like using your utensils wrong, right? Eating the wrong way. You put your fork in this hand and you do whatever, the scoop, or you slice, and it's like and so people will like really get up in arms about that stuff and say, this is the right way, this is the wrong way. What it really has to do with is that when the fork came over to America, Americans were already used to using spoons, which they were used with the dominant hand, because your weak hand isn't always the best at getting stuff from your plate to the mouth. If you think about it, that's very simple. Like, you have a certain hand that you probably use. I mean, you know what I mean? It's like, you ever try to use your non-dominant hand for stuff like that? It's like it's extra work. So when the fork came over, Americans used the same method. And that's why you will see a lot of Americans with a knife in their right hand and a fork in their left hand for cutting. And people look, especially the Europeans, look at us differently. And it's like, you don't know how to eat. It's like, well, really, we just learned at a different time. And it was because Americans were a little bit resistant to forks when they first came over that basically led to that. And so it goes, like I said, the knife in the right hand, the fork in the left hand, and then when they're done cutting, they put the knife down, pick up the fork with their dominant hand. And this is uniquely a uniquely American style of eating. And I must say, I do it too without even realizing. When I was reading this, it was like I had to stop and be like, what are they talking about? Like, I mean, because we start explaining it, forking this and fork, I'm like, I just eat. I don't know, but then when you think about it, and I was like, I actually do that. Yeah, I put the fork down, and then I put the knife down when I'm done cutting, and I pick up the fork. But there's a whole way of doing it where you do it the opposite way, where you put the knife in your left hand and the fork in your right hand, and then you cut, and then you just take. I can't believe I'm explaining how to eat on this podcast, but then you take the fork and you just put that in your mouth, right? And I've seen people do that, and I honestly thought it was just like a generational thing, but I mean, lo and behold, it's literally because we got forks late, bro. That's all it is. Like, we got as Americans, we got forks like 200 years after everybody else. I mean, as far as like being commonplace, so, you know what I mean? It was probably like when you go, it's like they said, for hundreds of years, utensils was a rich people thing. They were just a straight up, you have money, you don't eat with your hands, right? But if you don't have money, you eat with your hands. And then you go from that to here's a spoon, and then everyone else across the ponds got forks. And then they're like, why is this dude eating weird, when we give him forks? It's like, because he's only had a spoon for a couple hundred years. Y'all were over here forking it up for a long time. And so looking into this, I realized that there are over 30 different types of forks. I didn't know that. I would have probably assumed there were 7. I don't know why 7. Seems like a good solid number. But I'm only going to list like 8. But there are 30 types. So if you ever have nothing else to do with your life, you can find the other 22 types of forks out there. But they're table forks, deli forks, fish forks, salad forks, ice cream forks. I'm not sure if that's true. Fruit fork, dessert fork, and oyster fork. Yeah, and so I looked up a picture of an ice cream fork. What are we doing, people? First off, it's a spork. It's just a silver spork. And so I was thinking that sporks were some great new invention. They're just ice cream forks. But who in their right mind is eating ice cream and is like, anybody got an ice cream fork? I mean, maybe I just live in an uncultured world. That just, mind is blown. And so different types of forks. I figured I'd look, there are different types of words for silverware. I'm just going to throw a couple of those at you. Cutlery, silverware, like we mentioned, utensils, flatware, tableware. That's pretty much it. But then I found out something else called hollowware, which is it's not